Shadow pips are a gigantic source of power in Wizard101, but recently there's been a lot of talk about how powerful they ought to be. Y'all, today we're going to be talking about the future of shadow pips. One of the devs that work on this game, Ratbeard, I will link the VOD in the description. He talked about what might be the potential future of shadow pips.
I created a new note page, a new roadmap page for what I was calling Shadow Spell Reboot?
Now, a shadow spell reboot obviously sounds very, very interesting, right? Like, what would a reboot even entail? And obviously, even though I assume it's very early in the process of whatever this reboot would look like, Ratbeard went on to add more detail.
At the end of the day, when you look at it, it will end up being a nerf, I guess. So none of the shadow spells necessarily have to change in terms of what they do, but by playing with the various knobs that we have to play with, we might be able to make them feel better.
And to me, this all makes for a super, super interesting conversation. I think shadow pips are an extremely hot topic in the community. I think what intrigued me most about watching the VOD was specifically the comment about how there are various knobs that can basically be used. So the spell itself doesn't actually have to change in crazy ways. However, the actual value of the shadow pip could be adjusted. If we were to take a very iconic spell like Rusalka, right? I think what a reboot would look like if they shifted various knobs is that the PvE version of the spell really wouldn't change that much. And then in PvP, one of three things could happen. I think the spell could stay the exact same. However, while right now it seems to take about, 5 to 6 rounds, maybe 7, depending on your shadow rating to get a shadow pip, it might take longer. So therefore, you might actually end up using the actual shadow spells less or relying on other spells more. The second scenario is that they could actually make the value of the shadow pip when they're, using it on the damage per pip on the card, they could make that different. And that's just a really fancy way of saying, right, they have a way of organizing how much damage a spell does. This type of damage per pip with pip cost, they've been doing this for many, over a year at least, probably a little bit more. But when you look at how they calculate that Rusalka should do 1395 damage, right, they take the 6 pips that it already is and also add the number of pips a shadow pip is worth, which is somewhere between 3 and 4. I think Storm's damage per pip on all of their spells is 130 or something like that. Don't quote me, it's somewhere around there. And then they take the 6 plus the 3 to 4 pips that a shad is worth, and that's how they value the spell, right, using that 130 number. It's all just a fancy way of saying that if they wanted a shadow pip to be worth, 1 to 2 pips of damage instead of 3 to 4, they could do that, and we could see the actual strength of shadow hits, especially in PvP, go down. And the third option is that they could actually just keep the damage the same, but they could change the pip cost, whether it comes to the actual shads that you need or the actual pips that you need. There's a lot of directions an actual reboot like this could go, but all I know is that this could change a lot of problems that exist in the game, or it could create new ones. Right away, the big glaring flaw in my opinion with, reducing the power of shads is that there are way too many heals in this game that can just erase everything else. Here's the thing, in the absence of shadow hits, and especially in the absence of your opponent always threatening a shad on you, you could always do something like, actually put on the blades to do a scion. That's what this spell does. If you get 4 blades on yourself, you can do 2500 damage, way more than Rusalka could ever do. And while the thought of that is very exciting against non-healing schools, to actually have the opportunity to use all the spells in your toolkit in creative ways. Against healing schools, if you bladed, all you could ever potentially see is a bunch of banshees, remove a bunch of blades, replace them with a bunch of weaknesses, and satyr into the satyr into the satyr into the... I think the one, and this is literally the only real need for shads right now in this game, is just because of healing. So I hope that if they do reduce the value of a shad or somehow nerf it, I hope that healing or outgoing or healing per pip on spells is somewhat effective. I think if they did that, some of the really annoying stalling strategies that you might see in PP would die down, and also you wouldn't have to justify needing shads to be this powerful to begin with. The other things that I'm sure people are concerned about is how would this affect PvE and other forms of advanced combat outside of PvP. As I kind of alluded to earlier in the video, I don't really see them changing PvE that much with a change like this. And the reason for this is, one, if you're doing a fast strategy in PvE, you honestly probably don't even need a shad to begin with. And when we're talking about more important shads, right, like Glowbug or other AoEs, I have a feeling that they're gonna add a PvP version, a PvE version, much like we saw in Test Realm already. I think the devs are pretty aware that in PvE, especially when it comes to shads that are on AoEs, you don't really want that to be interrupted, so I really doubt that's gonna be affected. Now, with some of those potential pitfalls out of the way, let's talk about how this could be very, very good for the game. One, you might actually see some spell diversity, especially in PvP. The average deck on a Storm looks pretty much like this. Obviously, you know, some people will add more things and less things, but this deck has 3 Shadow Strikes, 4 Rusalkas, 2 Sultans, and 5 Darken Stormy. And the other non-shads that I do have are just meant to either keep me alive until I can cast a shad or make my shad more powerful. This entire game has become increasingly shadow-centric, and adding spell diversity could only mean good things for this game, in my opinion, as long as shads aren't needed to keep up with healing. The other massive W that could come out of this is that pay-to-win gear might not actually be a thing after they do this. Right now, especially at max level PvP, there's a gigantic problem with the Burrower gear, and I really do have a feeling that this gear set, as much horror as it's caused on the actual meta, it's exposed a very serious issue, and that it is that shads are OP. There's a reason why this gear set has exposed the real issue with shads, right? This is the first piece of gear that we've ever gotten at max level that gives block, that gives shads, and that also gives pierce. Now, obviously, the shadow rating, you know, you can see why that would be relevant to this conversation. But the fact that this gives block and also gives pierce, it makes it way better than Skyfarer gear or Eternal gear, because you could run multiple pieces of this without giving up too many important stats. You give up too much block, you give up too much pierce, you can't really compete. But this just gives up accuracy, and you can make it up in other places. So now the meta is just full of extremely high resist setups where you just spam shads. It's absolutely ridiculous, and the fact that you can only get this gear in a pack has exposed a serious issue with shads and has increased a pay-to-win situation in PvP. It's the same with raid gear too. When the Dragonspire raid came out, the only people with real access to shads were people that could do raids, and that's not everybody. And while I do think giving up shad rating should come with some consequences of some sort, you should never feel like if you don't have enough shadow pieces of gear from a pack that you simply cannot PvP, and for the first time ever, that is the case in this meta. So a change like this, it could actually lower the barrier of entry to things like PvP, and it could also open up the way for strategies where you could actually afford to, you know, play around with giving up a piece of shad rating for once in your life. All in all, I'm very curious on exactly what direction they go with shads, how it will affect the future of PvE and PvP, but I want to hear y'all's opinions. Do you guys like the state of shads right now? I know some people do. I would love to know why. And if you don't, how would you change it so that, you know, how would you reboot shads if you were given the option? As always, drop a like if you enjoyed, leave a sub if you're new. There's tons of things on this to talk about, so I look forward to reading all of y'all's comments. Stay awesome, y'all. See y'all soon, and yeah.